Hello, everyone. Welcome to a new episode of the Dissenter. I'm your host, as always, Ricardo Lopes, and today I'm joined for a second time by Dr. Vlasta Sikimić. She is assistant professor at the Eindhoven University of Technology. I'm leaving a link to our first interview in the description of this one, and today we're talking mostly about cognitive diversity in science and its importance, and also a little bit about the philosophy and ethics of AI. So Vlasta, welcome back to the show. It's always a pleasure to talk with you.
Thank you so much for the invitation, and I'm very happy to be here again.
Okay, so let's start with the topic of cognitive diversity. So to start off with, what is cognitive diversity?
Cognitive diversity is used in epistemology to understand different ways of reasoning, and it can also be used from the perspective of psychology, whether someone has different type of biases, different type of ways of processing information. What is of interest for us is to also understand epistemic diversity. And I must admit immediately that I even consulted with some of my colleagues in preparation for this interview. And we realized that we are using not clearly these two terms, but often interchangeably, which might not be the case. It's something to think about. The point there is that when we can have social diversity, which I think is intuitive for everyone, that people come from different backgrounds, and that they have different social experiences. But what we sometimes neglect is the epistemic aspect or a cognitive aspect. And that's the way how someone is processing information, the background knowledge that one has. Also, when we talk about epistemic diversity, these are even some positions that we might take in philosophy of science, or in general. So the way how do we learn, the way how do we observe the world, some background assumptions that we are having from which we are building further hypotheses. Mm-hmm. And that becomes really relevant, not only in philosophy of science, but also in epistemology in general, because the premise is that, and there is good evidence for it, that when we have the diversity of thought, this will help on the group level to gather more appropriate knowledge. And I guess then we will dive into the conditions that need to be satisfied for that to happen.
Yeah, but I mean, just to try to make this a little bit more clear, are we, when it comes to cognitive diversity here, are we talking about specific ways that people diverge in terms of their ways of processing information psychologically? I mean, I was thinking, for example, this is just an example of the work done by cultural psychologists and people like Richard Nisbett when they talk, for example, about analytic versus holistic thinking, and he compares, for example, Western people to East Asian people in their thinking. I mean, are those the kinds of things we are talking about, or what exactly? I mean, when it comes to cognitive processing or cognitive mechanisms, or are we not talking about specific ways of processing information, or just in a more general way, people just coming from different, I don't know, cultural backgrounds, social backgrounds, and things like
that? Thank you. This was an excellent example that you used. And indeed, that would be an example of cognitive diversity. The different social background will not necessarily make someone cognitively diverse. There is a high chance that this will be the case, or let's say epistemically diverse. But if we are if we went to the same school, if we were exposed to the similar content, if we belong to the same ways of thinking, like what you just said, like in the Western way of thinking, then it's likely that our cognitive diversity or epistemic diversity, or again, these two terms are not identical, will be different. And there is also, so when we think about the epistemic diversity, it can also be about which type of methods in science I want to use, right? Whether I'm a qualitative psychologist or whether I'm a quantitative psychologist or whether I like the mixed methodology, and whether what I'm experienced in. So now imagine a team of experimental psychologists hiring someone doing quantitative research, hiring someone from the qualitative side. And this person can really be beneficial for the team because it can add certain depth to their type of research. But we have to ask then this researcher to help with, for instance, implementing some mixed methods, adding some additional layers, doing qualitative analysis indeed. And if you just say to this person, okay, now you need to learn all the methods, or I mean, presumably they know it because they study it, and just apply them the way how we are applying, then this diversity will be lost, because there, one of the ideas there is that we want to get knowledge. Another thing where diversity makes a lot of sense in the epistemic context is when we think about the context of epistemic justice or injustice. And by the fact that someone is a woman, for instance, means that this person has specific experiences which only this person can explain. And we know this from the literature on intellectual justice and injustice, and that there was like a huge paradigm that women cannot do difficult work or physically difficult work, or that we cannot do intellectually the same as men. But then you kind of get some other counterexamples and experiences, and that enters then the general discourse. But you need a testimony from someone belonging to that specific group to explain, okay, this is actually happening here and it's not being recognized. So it's a multifaceted point. Then we talk about the cognitive diversity. Indeed, there can also be the thinking styles, different cognitive, potentially even some types of neurodiversity and so on. But in this epistemic domain, we can really observe also these other type of phenomena, right? So just our background, our positionality. And that's why it's very helpful in the research papers to always specify what is our positionality. And that helps the reader to understand where we come from. And if we are working, right, so I'm saying I am a woman, I come from East Europe, and I can write from this perspective. I could maybe be sensitive to gender issues. I am sensitive to this East-West division. But of course, it's not that I can now testify for people who belong to other communities and who have the different observation of the world and different style of thinking about the world. If I would be exposed to that type of culture, or if I was studying in such an environment or working, that would for sure change the situation. But also having colleagues coming from different backgrounds, willing to test different hypotheses, having different perspectives is very helpful if we are listening and if we are ready to learn from them, because there is no one right way to do science, but also in general to communicate with people, because these questions in epistemology, they are related to the questions of the trust in science, but they are also related to the questions of how we are learning from each other and how much we understand each other. And the more we understand each other and the more we're open to different types of thinking and understand that different experiences leads to different behavior, that expands our horizons, and it's very helpful. So it leads to some type of wisdom of the crowds potentially, instead of, on the other hand, polarization, that we say, okay, you don't think the same as we do, thus your viewpoint is not legitimate. And that would be an example of an exclusion of someone based on the opinions.
So when it comes to epistemic diversity specifically, I was wondering, does that include people being diverse in terms of, for example, the different ways they approach science. I mean, let me just give perhaps two different kinds of examples. I am not sure if in philosophy nowadays you still use these terms, or if people still identify as such. But let's say, for example, someone might have a more idealist approach and another might have a more empiricist approach, or someone might be perhaps still on the camp of positivism or positivist like, something like that. Or even, for example, another example would be someone might come from a perspective of a substance ontology, and another person from a perspective of process ontology. I mean, are those, let's say, I'm not sure if I should call this theoretical diversity, because basically it's people coming or bringing to the table different theoretical approaches and perspectives. But do these kinds of things apply in the context of epistemic diversity? Do you also consider these differences in terms of kinds of thinking or not?
Definitely. These examples, and thank you for them, Ricardo. This is how we think of epistemic diversity in philosophy, and already also what you explained before, coming from a lot of philosophy that's being now taught in Western Europe has this history of philosophy coming from Western Europe. So we get this classical education that starts from a pre-Socratic period and goes over rationalism or Kant, I mean, like the Western thinkers. Yeah. And of course, a lot of us don't get enough exposure to different type of philosophy, and that will form some background assumptions that we are having. And of course, but that is completely, so Fichte was also saying this, right? The type of person you are, the type of philosophy you're choosing, and that is completely legitimate. So for me, formal approaches to philosophy were resonating, but that doesn't mean that this is the only approach which is valid and to which we should pay attention. On the contrary, I find it very nice to receive different perspectives and to then also go deeper in my research. But it's also legitimate that we have the division of people working on different subcategories of research, as long as eventually we can aggregate that knowledge, which happens over the longer periods of time, and make some recommendations. And I think it's very enriching and very interesting to have the positive view on diversity, and because in the nowadays we are facing this, that there is this pressure that people have to really think in one way, or that it even gets connected with the social belonging, the way how we are thinking on some values that we have. But even if we have different background values, that can help us to be cognitively diverse as a team. And again, as long as, so there is one premise that we have to have some intellectual tolerance towards each other. As long as we have the intellectual tolerance towards each other and openness towards each other, that can be really beneficial. The other aspect that I wanted to point out is that even kind of mistakes in reasoning in science often, I mean, can be fruitful. And also someone who is like, it's not immediately clear what is the rational thing, but people can just follow their passion, can maybe even have some biases. If we spent a lot of time exploring one hypothesis, the hypothesis is not working, we have the sunk cost bias and we want to work further on it. So rational thing would be to drop it, and that's something that I wrote about. But from the perspective of a bigger team, it does make sense that people even who have biases are there and who not only, well, we all have biases, but I mean the people who follow their biases in research are there because sometimes that leads to a breakthrough. The more, so one simple explanation is think of the epistemic space. So we are trying to learn something, and we have an epistemic space. We are exploring epistemic space. We are exploring it together. And if we are all only in one point A and around this point of the epistemic space, then all other parts of it get neglected. So it is good that people are exploring other parts of it and that we try to encourage them to do it, that we have the understanding for it. So I guess nowadays, because again of the politically heated debate about the diversity and inclusion in the US academia, we are now making a case for why it matters. And not only, I mean, it really matters also for the people, not only from the group perspective, but even from the individual perspective. And someone challenges our viewpoints and shows us, look, we can think in a radically different way that can also help us to think better and open our horizons, or only just challenge us to answer and to sharpen our ideas and to, maybe have better answers and better understanding for our own position.
Mm-hmm. So let me ask you, because nowadays, and particularly in certain countries like the US, when people promote diversity in academia, they usually talk about, or primarily talk about, diversity in political viewpoints or diversity in terms of political orientation. They say, for example, that we should have more right-wing people in academia because there's too many left-wing people. I mean, is political orientation also something to be considered when it comes to cognitive diversity or not? And is political orientation really a good enough proxy for cognitive diversity?
I think there are two debates currently happening. One is there were these measures of hiring people and promoting people or trying to empower people from the underprivileged groups. Mm-hmm. And it has social impact. It has a long-lasting social impact because the more people who get the opportunity to get education and the more people who are on these higher academic positions, they just by example are leading and are making a change. And we have to keep in mind that academia was closed and it's still often closed, especially in some disciplines, for specific genders already. Mm. And just imagine other underprivileged groups. Because I can also talk from my own experience that I get feedback from my students who are the third-year students at the technical university and from one specific group, right? There are different groups. So we are teaching engineers, we're teaching philosophy to engineers. So from this one group, several people told me that I am their some said that I'm their second female lecturer, and others said that I'm their third female lecturer during the 3 years of how long they studied. And that is worrisome. And I am not even an expert in their subject, so I'm even teaching them philosophy. And if you would have kind of more role models, female role models on these higher positions, the assumption is, okay, that will also encourage other women and girls and parents, because everyone has to get motivated and believe, teachers in primary schools, right, to motivate them to pursue this type of career. And there was even one research which I found very interesting, pointing out that in the end of high school, it is not the difference between boys and girls. The point within the natural science subjects and humanities, and they were performing similarly well in natural sciences. It's just that in humanities, girls were performing better. Mm-hmm. And they use this again. So this is just a research that was done. But I found this, it was an empirical research, but I found this engaging. I think Brede and Napa are the authors of that research. Maybe we can link it later. If I'm mistaken, please, or mispronouncing the names, please accept my apology. I found already this idea interesting, right? That it can be something completely, if you're really good in humanities, someone tells you, okay, then you have to study humanities, and it's not opening the option, okay, but you're also good in natural sciences. Maybe you should explore that. Maybe that is a nice career for you. It won't be a nice career if you enter a classroom and you are in the minority and there are no female teachers with whom you can connect, and that all adds pressure over time. So that is one aspect of why we want some type of diversity in science. This is a social aspect. But then we have the epistemic aspect, is of course the different type of dynamics, social dynamics, intellectual exchange, different type of thinking will be brought when we have people from diverse backgrounds. And again, this might be more obvious in humanities when I say, okay, my positionality, where I come from, can shape my thought, then I can think about feminist philosophy in a certain way. And of course, also men are most welcome to enter and think about feminist philosophy, and that is highly desirable. I'm just trying to say, when I say men, I mean, the straight men, the paradigm, but they are most welcome and it would be super helpful. And they do, and that is great. And that is this inclusive environment. So everyone is invited to do it. And that will also bring the whole field and the whole subject, it will bring more attention to it. It will sharpen it and it will develop it. And that we see very strongly in natural sciences, in social sciences, but even in natural sciences, when you do biology or when you do medicine, the gender does matter. So I would definitely, keep that in mind. And also will bring different perspectives, and maybe will also bring the idea of which type of research to prioritize. Which type of questions are more bothersome for women, and to lead it in that way. So I think that all matters. And the deeper we dive, we can realize why it matters. So that is then the epistemic component, why this type of diversity would make sense. But when you ask specifically about the other aspect, and this is this political, whether we want more right-wing people in science, and that I think is a great question, and I like this question. And well, let's first say that contrary to popular or to the mainstream view, I would say yes, we do, or at least we should be blinded towards someone's political orientation. So we should definitely not exclude someone because they are right-wing. I even did the empirical research, we last time talked about it, on the impact of socio-political attitudes on the views of scientists. And indeed, scientists also in the research we did, but also in other studies that we surveyed, are usually more on the left side. And this is some experience we are probably also noticing, all of us who work in science or everyone who communicates with scientists and so on. But sometimes you also wonder how much people are actually talking because of the social pressure, and how much silent they are because of this microclimate social pressure. And again, I can also say my positionality will be more on the left. However, also maybe again, because of my positionality, because of everything that I experienced through my childhood and growing up in a country that was torn by war, I have a lot of understanding for people who come from the right-wing perspective, and they often do that because of, not always, right? But some people do that because they felt that this is what preserves their identity, this is what preserves their life, ultimately. And I would not like them to be excluded. It is a challenge, of course, to have the open dialogue between the groups, but I am very sympathetic to people coming from the right. Again, modulo that certain ways of communication, human rights and so on are there. And I think this is really important. What I also think is that it should be welcomed that they express, that everyone expresses. How I was feeling now free to express my political orientation is that also other people feel free to express their political orientation. And not only to say this in confidence to me because they know I'm not a judgmental person, but are not speaking out loud within larger groups because then they think they would be stigmatized. I think that's really problematic. Number one. Number two is the question, how impactful is the political orientation on someone's research? And that was some of the findings of this paper. They were kind of promising is that within the specific field of research, people are not overly influenced, scientists are not overly influenced by their social political orientation, which is a promising thing. But we know historically that science can be really politicized and can also be abused for different political agendas. And that's something that we have to protect science from, because science is probably it's still highly trusted by the general population. Not still, it also makes sense that it is. But if someone comes from the perspective of the epistemic authority, if someone is also a lecturer at the university and is spreading a political agenda, no matter from which side, that is violating people's rights, but it's also kind of imposing the pressure that you have to think in certain ways, or installing certain values which shouldn't. And it can also justify practices, which again, of course, when we talk about it, everyone thinks immediately about the Second World War period, but and kind of how harmful using science for political agenda can be. But we should also keep in mind that even coming from the left wing, or it doesn't have to be left wing, it can also be this neoliberal paradigm, which is advocating for freedoms, but is excluding others, potentially, not always, of course, that is also dangerous. So in my opinion, I am always very careful about funding which has a political background. And I think that always has to be acknowledged if you received for some type of research funding that comes from a political background, no matter whether this is from the liberal part, conservative part, right, left, and so on, that we are just aware, because funding, for instance, science funding can really direct science in different ways. And if you feel the obligation that it can also be the implicit pressure to kind of deliver what you promised in the grant application, to deliver really, if you promise that you will detect certain effects, or if you promise that you will work on, reconciliation, which is of course a nice idea, but then you realize that actually there are some deeper problems why this cannot happen, and then you might still misreport it because, again, of these idealistic ideas, but maybe also because of the expectations of the funder. Then it's important, right? So if you work on reconciliation, which I think is an exceptionally interesting and important topic, but we have to understand the perspective of both sides. We have to be there neutral as much as possible. And then in social sciences, we know it's not really possible to be completely neutral. That's why we have to report our positionality. So I would be there. I think it's a big topic. And I would be very careful about it. And also one thing to keep in mind, the last thing, I'm sorry if I'm taking too much time. Also, a lot of our students might be coming from different political backgrounds, and they are, because I interact with them, and just ignoring or denying, or it is not helpful. So one has to understand where they come from, and we are there to have a dialogue with them in higher education, and also to acknowledge it and acknowledge their arguments and be there for them and so forth. So that's why I think for someone who wants to be a proper intellectual, practices of trying to, at least when we are at workplace, to be neutral regarding the political orientation is really important.
So what would you say are perhaps the best ways for us to promote cognitive diversity in science specifically? I mean, do you think that things like just removing or trying to remove as most as possible biases and barriers and obstacles would be enough for us to have more cognitive diversity in science and in, I guess, academia more generally? Or do you think that we need things or solutions that are perhaps a little bit more interventional, like affirmative action in hiring and in helping certain kinds of students attend university? I mean, what kinds of solutions do you think are best?
I'm writing down the notes. Yes, I really like one quote which says, "Diversity without inclusion is an empty gesture." And I think we need inclusion. Inclusion doesn't have to only come from affirmative measures. It can be something much simpler, what we talked about just now, and this is to try to be open to different viewpoints, to consider them legitimate as much as possible, if we are in the simple example we had from before, right? We are hiring someone who is doing qualitative research in our highly quantitative lab. We did that deliberately because we want this person to bring this new diverse aspect, and that's why we're going to let this person do qualitative research, and we will try to learn from it and be open to it. Otherwise, if we are just trying to make this person do the same as what we are doing, which is highly likely that it will work, but that doesn't bring any benefit of the epistemic diversity. So the inclusion is important, and epistemic inclusion, which means that we really then consider these viewpoints and really try to integrate them within our research. And when it comes to the affirmative actions, that again is a big debate, because some people feel the majority group can start feeling envy or can find it unjust. And that's why we have to be careful with affirmative actions. What you asked about education, there I have a very leftist view. Education should be available as much as possible to everyone, and that everyone should be encouraged and possibly stimulated to go to education if they have the motivation, to get education if they have motivation. I think it's also completely legitimate not to have this motivation and just be happy in different ways. But so I wouldn't go to this perfectionism of, oh, you have to motivate everyone to study. No. But for people who do want it, I feel that we as a society have to provide as much as possible resources that this happens. And a lot of actually professors do share this, and that's why professors also like to give interviews as this one, but also put their courses on some of these open platforms. And whether that will bring education closer to everyone, I don't know. We can only hope. But we also often give guest lectures and education, like also mentoring when someone approaches us and so on. And we do this for free, but it's not for free, it's for our soul, because we are happy to do it. And I think a lot of people are actually happy to do it. They see this as one of the very important things of our job. Then also, I think it's also nice and important that we are publishing the ones, people who have the opportunity to publish open access. And I know, because I also, again, based on my positionality, I was also in the environment in which you couldn't afford to pay the fees to publish open access and so on. And I know there are different types of open access, so some where one doesn't have to pay and so on. But in any case, if you're in a privileged position that you can afford this, and that both in the career terms and in the financial terms, that is also a great thing to make a lot of resources available, and people are really doing it. My professor of logic from Belgrade, who unfortunately passed away, but he wrote a lovely book for high school students about logic, and that book is freely available, and it's in Serbian language, but everyone can download it and read it. And I think that's something which I think he felt as one of his legacies, and very, very nice thing to do.
So on the topic of cognitive diversity, is there anything else you think is important to add, or that I might have missed in my questions, or can we move to the philosophy of AI?
Your questions were excellent, as always. Maybe I can just shortly connect it with intellectual virtues, because we talked a lot about diversity from the perspective of the social epistemology and kind of how socially it makes sense. And we touched upon these virtues of open-mindedness, of epistemic tolerance, of intellectual justice, and also epistemic charity, I would also say, to always interpret in the most charitable way what someone is saying, to not care about language fluency, but to care about the content. So all these things are something which we can also on the individual level practice in order to become more epistemically inclusive.
Mm-hmm. Great. So let's talk then a little bit about the philosophy and ethics of artificial intelligence then. So you worked on a set of ethical guidelines for development, implementation, and use of robust and accountable artificial intelligence adopted by the government of Serbia. So first of all, what are these guidelines and why were they needed?
Maybe to make a connection between the two topics.
Okay.
Just to say that use of AI can potentially decrease the epistemic diversity. And it can decrease it in education. It could also decrease it in science, because based on what the AI is trained, there can be some dominant way of thinking coming from it. And this is research that my colleague Aleksandra Vučković and I did regarding the use of AI in education and the potential epistemic danger of the global injustice that could also come from these epistemic parts, that there is a dominant paradigm, that we are teaching children something which is in the dominant paradigm, and also not critically assessing it enough. And we know this now, even UNESCO is pointing out that critical thinking in the era of AI is becoming really important. And one of the important aspects that we want to teach everyone when it comes to the critical thinking is exactly to question and to check whether this viewpoint is fair and diverse enough. And the fairness comes together with diversity, and that is one of the principles that responsible AI has to follow. And you asked me about the Serbian guidelines. I was very happy to contribute to them. They were written right before almost the huge generative AI expansion. But there was this visionary view that and like a larger strategy also in Serbia, as everywhere else in the world, I assume, to develop ethically driven AI. And it had two purposes. One is to provide platform for people who are developing AI to really, there are even forms attached to this document, which one can go through to check whether their AI solution is low risk, high risk, what should change in order to make it ethically acceptable and so forth. So one was this to really help people who are developing it to develop it in an ethical way. The other one was, of course, understanding that this is a big question of the future and that we need to align the general laws, which we do have about data privacy, dignity, autonomy, and so on, that we align that with the use of new technology, because it's not always clear what is happening in which case. And the ethical guidelines are part of the soft law, so they're just recommendations. Based on them later, specific legal solutions and strategies are made.
So I would like for you to tell us a little bit about the main ethical principles that drive the guidelines, namely explainability and verifiability, dignity, prohibition to cause damage, and fairness. So tell us about each of them and why these ethical principles specifically.
Yeah, there are certain common frameworks that we are thinking about when using AI, that what is being implemented on people needs to, we need to have certain control of it and to have the understanding of it, and that we can also check and dispute what is happening within the specific technological solution. It has to respect our dignity, and it should always, like, the first thing one has to prove is that your AI solution is actually bringing some benefit and that it's not causing harm. Then the fairness aspect is something which I find very important, because what I touched just now upon, the fairness also has the epistemic dimension. So it has a social dimension, that someone can be discriminated by AI, but it also has an epistemic dimension. Let's go back again to the simplest example. We use automated translation. The automated translator from the English language, in which we don't have genders, now translates a text into Serbian, which is a language which has genders, translates a doctor as male and a nurse as female. And this is, maybe it's one of the common examples. And this, of course, can have certain impacts because it is encoding stereotypes and biases which we are having as a society. So it mirrors these biases, but we want that this doesn't really happen. But it can even have depending on which area we are using AI for, it can even have bigger impact. And so if certain biases are there, then we can also, algorithmic biases, then it can also hinder us from learning properly, but we are getting the information which is biased. And then we have an additional problem, is how much we trust the machines. And that is a big question, right? So, and it's an empirical question, which psychologists are trying to study, and we often trust the machine a lot. I know that there are conflicting viewpoints on it, but the machines can be very suggestive. And those are some of the aspects that come with the epistemic questions. But of course, AI can really have deep, profound impacts on human life, especially if you use it in certain domains. And already, like, if you use it to decide who will get a credit and who will not get a credit, and if some discrimination there is being used, that can be really bad. Systems which are recommending, I mean, in the law, there are some ideas of its application to kind of see kind of who might commit a crime again. That can also be very potentially dangerous, can have really strong effects on one's life. Or we can have some applications which are more neutral, right? So we are just trying to optimize the distribution of the gas stations around the city, whatever, or the bus stops, or whatever. It also has some impact, but it is less of an impact on humans. And what is important, why is important to have some of these basic criteria, is because whenever we want to test a certain AI solution, we can think about it within these criteria. So if we are using a medical AI, we are thinking, okay, is this really helpful? Can we really explain why this is being used? Or sometimes we don't know what's actually going on, but it's implemented on people, and that is dangerous. Is it really fair to all the patients? Do patients feel that their dignity is not being respected? Similarly, we are using some tool for the use of AI in education. So we again think through these principles and try to see whether they are matching. Of course, there is the privacy as well, and it's also mentioned in the document. And what I think is also nice is that these principles can be connected with certain virtuous behaviors. So they can also be some recommendations of how to, as a developer, how to think about the solutions, whether they are satisfying them, and as a legislator, to what one should say yes and no. And if we are having the ethical and responsible AI, ultimately, this is also good for the users, because then users can trust it more. And I think it's also good that users also are aware of certain criteria and think about it. Okay, is the AI really is it really explainable? Is it honestly made? Is the privacy, is the fairness there? The fairness translates to this intellectual justice, epistemic justice, right? So are we, or justice in general? So it has, as I said, both epistemic and non-epistemic component. But one can really think, okay, but is this following this type of virtues? And then do I want to use it or I don't want to use it? Do I want to give my data into this system or not? Or even, we have to keep in mind some of these solutions are suboptimal, right? So we will all use translation tools or generative AI for generating text, but we have to be then aware to critically think, okay, there is this fairness question. It might misrepresent certain groups, and then I'm aware of it, so I will correct for it. Mm-hmm. One example I give to students are the photos generated by DALL-E, where you see kind of, I asked it to create inclusive science. And it gives different pictures. It's really hard to get it as inclusive as possible with a lot of prompting. And then even with that, you notice that there is no older women in picture. So you might get different groups, but when you intersect when you intersect these groups, then you might still have the underrepresentation. And then the idea is, okay, you show a picture to students and ask them, okay, what is wrong on the picture? What is missing on the picture? And if they are aware of it, that is already helpful, because that's the best we can do, because of course AI is very helpful and brings a lot of efficiency to us. So sometimes it is a balancing act of trying the optimal solution. And I think that the ethical guidelines are exactly in this spirit, that we wanted to facilitate the progress, provide some framework for both legal solutions, but also for the developers and users to really see how they can do this responsibly and what the potential consequences might be of their solutions. I hope that not many people have immediately evil plans. It just might go wrong.
Yeah. So another question, what constitutes a high-risk artificial intelligence system?
When these systems are influencing life of humans in a significant way, mm-hmm. And profiling them, this is how we were reasoning here. But we also, what I'm very proud of, we also consider the environment, so the ecological aspect. And we also, I think this was the first act, which actually considered the animal welfare as well. I mean, I would even go stronger and say animal rights, but I mean, this is already great. And it was my humble contribution, which came from the work of my colleague Thilo Hagendorf from Tübingen and Peter Singer, the famous ethicist, who were at that time already pointing out the potential impact of AI on animals. I think nowadays that will become more and more standard. So we have to take care of our planet, living beings in the planet, and that AI is not giving recommendations which can harm neither animals nor environment, and of course, especially humans. And we are there in the document. It's the human aspect is, of course, being elaborated on, and some of the cases which are the high-risk cases, not only I mean also in other acts that I was reading, because you have to do that to prepare, and it also makes sense, very related to the healthcare, education, because there it can really impact someone's life, very related to the justice system, very related to something that could potentially hinder democracy. So also that is and there I would say for sure a different type of media, not only social media but also the standard media, if the AI is used too much for generating texts, can become problematic. So those are just some illustrations, but this list is not exhaustive. And what is very important is that we always have to update such lists, and then that is written and noted in the document. And the technology might develop in ways that we are not fully aware yet, and that's why it's important that this is not fixed, but that we are constantly revising it. And when we say that something is high risk, doesn't always mean that it's prohibited, right? So use of AI in education shouldn't just be prohibited. That's not the point. The point is that there has to be a special care and special attention of how it is implemented.
Mm-hmm. So I asked you about the ethical guidelines, but now what does it mean for AI to be robust and accountable? What does that mean exactly?
That it gives reliable estimates, or depends what we're using it for, outputs over different uses and parameters, that it has also this, from the technical perspective, high accuracy of what it's doing. But I think it's, for me, very important that to keep the idea of the human in the loop, even though we are seeing that we are going more and more in the automation direction. But the human still, I mean, in my opinion, has to be the one who decides about values, who decides about the quality, who guarantees for its use and implementation. So I would always, it's also important, and I think this is how the legislators nowadays are thinking, that there has to always be a human responsible for whatever is doing, because the human can also do monitoring and updating, and I mean, I definitely think that human control is important.
So, I mean, my last question, then, I think that you've already partly answered it in your previous answer, but what are then the requirements for AI to be robust and accountable?
So of course, to follow the principles which we discussed, and I would even say these principles are not necessarily exhaustive, they're just the main ones to follow the privacy, to follow the dignity, fairness, explainability, beneficence, that it is causing no harm and it is actually doing some good, that it's performing well, that it has, I mean, that is part of it, right? So what we say, that it's really doing good, that it's performing well on these parameters, that it's useful, and again, so I don't want to finish on the note of being too critical towards technology. On the contrary, I think technology is great. And then we have the trustworthy technology that can help us a lot. And what I mean by trustworthy is that it is also designed for humans, by humans. And that is this is maybe an addition which is not in the law, but this is what I think is very important, is that it really takes into account also the underprivileged groups and how the underprivileged groups might be, that's part of the fairness, of course, but in order that humans trust AI, the AI really has to satisfy our criteria and our demands also when we are in the underprivileged group, so that we really feel that this is doing a good job for us. Often we are not aware of it, so I think it's a complex system where AIs now interact with humans, and there the education plays a role that we really understand what AI can do, what AI cannot do, at least at the moment, how it is developing. And yeah, I always encourage everyone, let's try to use it. let's try to experiment with it. Then we will also know what are the boundaries and how we feel about it, and to maintain the critical attitude and the trust in our own judgment.
Mm-hmm. Great. So where can people find you and your work on the internet?
Yes, of course, on my webpage. I have a personal webpage, vlastasikimić.com. And also on my LinkedIn page, on my university webpage. My first and last name are a unique combination. So when you type me, you cannot miss me.
Okay, great. So thank you so much for coming on the show again. It's always a great pleasure to everyone.
Thank you so much. And thank you for all these wonderful efforts and the educational material you're providing for everyone.
Hi guys, thank you for watching this interview until the end. If you liked it, please share it, leave a like and hit the subscription button. This show is brought to you by Enlights, learning and development done differently. Check their website at enlights.com, and also please consider supporting the show on Patreon or PayPal. I would also like to give a huge thank you to my main patrons and PayPal supporters: Per Ergo Larsen, Jerry Mullerens, Fredrik Sunda, Bernardo Seixas, Olaf Alex, Adam Kessel, Matthew Whittingburg, Arno Wolf, Tim Hollis, Eric Alenia, John Connors, Philip Forrest Connolly, Dan Demetri, Robert Windiger, Rui Inácio, Zup, Marco Neves, Colin Holbrook, Phil Kavanagh, Mikkel Stormir, Samuel André, Francis Fortiago Nunes, Fergal Kossen, Hal Herzog, Nuno Machado, Jonathan Labyrinth, João Linhares, Stantantia, Samuel Correia, Eric Hines, Mark Smith, João Eira, Tom Hummel, Sardas France, David Sloan Wilson, Yacila Dez Araújo, Romain Roach, Diego Londonho Correia, Yannick Punter, Adana Rusmani, Charlotte Bliss, Nicole Barbaro, Adam Hunt, Pavlo Stasevski, Nelek Bach, Guy Madison, Gary G. Alman, Sam Afzal, Adrian Yeager, Paul Tolentino, João Barbosa, Julian Price, Edward Hall, Edin Bronner, Douglas Fry, Franca Bortolotti, Gabriel Ponce Cortez, Ursula Litsky, Scott, Zachary Fish, Tim Duffy, Sonny Smith, John Wiseman, Daniel Friedman, William Buckner, Paul George Arnaud, Luke Lowacki, Georgios Theophanos, Chris Williamson, Peter Wolozin, David Williams, Diogo Costa, Anton Erickson, Charles Murray, Alex Shaw, Maury Martinez, Coralie Chevalier, Bangalore Atheists, Larry Dealey Jr., Old Erringbon, Sterry, Michael Bailey, Dan Sperber, Robert Grassi, Igor N., Jeff McMahon, Jake Zool, Barnabas Radix, Mark Campbell, Thomas Dovner, Luke Nissen, Chris Story, Kimberly Johnson, Benjamin Galbert, Jessica Nowicki, Linda Brandon, Nicholas Carlson, Ismail Benzliman, George Coriatis, Valentin Steinman, Per Crowley, Kate Van Goller, Alexander Hubbard, Liam Dunaway, BR, Masood Ali Mohammadi, Perpendicular, Jonas Hertner, Ursula Goodenough, Gregory Hastings, David Pinsoff, Sean Nelson, Mike Lavigne, and Dios Necht. A special thanks to my producers, Isar Webb, Jim Frank, Lucas Stafiniak, Tom Vanagdam, Bernard Ugni, Curtis Dixon, Benedict Mueller, Thomas Trumbull, Catherine and Patrick Tobin, Giancarlo Montenegro, Alnick Ortiz, and Nick Golden, and to my executive producers, Matthew Lavender, Sergio Quadriano, Bogdan Kanivets, and Rosie. Thank you for all.